Thank you very much for joining today. My name is Nikunj Trivedi, and I'm currently serving as the president of the Coalition of Hindus of North America. We are a grassroots level advocacy organization looking to create a better understanding of Hinduism in North America. Today's topic is regarding the Hindu Parents Network, and we're going to be focusing on bullying and Hindu kids, impacts on bullying, and some of the solutions and tips that might be relevant for parents and some students who are also joining today. So we have a esteemed panel here, which I'm going to introduce in a little while. But first, what I wanted to do is I wanted to provide an opportunity for two students and one student and one young professional to share their story of how they have been, how they have studied Hindu Dharma and what they have seen in schools and how they have been bullied during their time in school and how that has been, it continues in the things that we have been seeing in school curriculums and so on and so forth. So first, I wanted to introduce Sucharita Jayanti. Sucharita is a graduate of Dartmouth, and she has been part of Hindu Students Council for a few years now. And it's been a pleasure working with Sucharita. So Sucharita, I wanted to start with you. Maybe you can share a few minutes of your experiences in high schools and what you have seen so far.
Yeah. Namaste, Nikunj, and namaste, everyone. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about my journey. As Nikunj mentioned, I am a young professional, so that means that I've graduated college. I'm in graduate school right now, actually. And so I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about some of the experiences I've had throughout my journey at different ages that might relate to kind of what you've seen your kids go through, or if you're students, what you've been going through. So for me, I grew up in Hanover, New Hampshire. So essentially the middle of nowhere as far as the Indian and Hindu community is concerned. Like when I grew up, when I was in elementary school, I was not only the only Hindu kid in my entire school, but one of like 3 non-white children in my entire school. So that was a very kind of isolated environment from a Hinduism perspective. So my parents tried very hard to make sure that I learned kind of the Hindu samskara like growing up. And so they would like teach me a lot of those things at home. And I was kind of a very traditional Indian Hindu kid. So I'd go to school with my bottu or bindi. I would like have my hair like with oiled up in like 2 braids and kind of like have my little Indian lunchbox with like idlis or whatever in it. And I think it was like a rich way to grow up. And I'm in retrospect, glad I had those experiences. But at the time, there was a lot of difficulties that I faced kind of going through that. Everything from kids kind of being like, why is your skin so dark? And like, there's a dot on your forehead always. Don't you like shower in the morning? Like your hair smells like, and like, the worst thing you can say to a 6-year-old kid is, don't you shower? Like that's like the worst possible insult that kids that the age could throw. So it was very scarring and jarring to me personally. And so that was kind of elementary school. And then as we got into like middle school and high school, this idea of like religion started to be something that my friends were becoming more familiar with. And I was facing kind of all kinds of issues from, like we all go to church together and you're never there. Like, do you like not believe in God? Like, what do you believe in? Like, are you evil? Like whatever stuff. But also just things like as people learned about Hinduism, things that the curriculum would say, like Hindus pray to like cows and animals. And there's a way to present all of that makes it beautiful about like the divinity of everything living and non-living in the world. And there's a way to present that makes fellow 11, 12-year-olds make fun of you. And I think like a lot of what I saw kind of in the official textbooks and curriculum kind of presented things in the latter way. And that led to like a lot of having to deal with kids completely misinterpreting my culture and othering me. And that kind of experience continued also in high school, if you look at the textbooks, and especially I think in college. As you grow up, I think your fellow classmates become more and more sensitive to being inclusive and diversity and things. And the curriculum that you're dealing with and what textbooks are saying, what the world is saying about your culture becomes a lot more harsh and judgmental and kind of beating you down. And so there's that kind of balance of like, you have insensitive 5-year-olds asking you if you bother to shower in the morning, versus in college, your classmates are supportive, but you're dealing with just an academic culture that says that, hey, you're Hindu, that means you're wrong. That means by nature you discriminate and you treat people badly. And Hinduism is just about discriminating against women or like people of certain births or whatever else. So that was kind of my journey of kind of going through all of these experiences, all in a very rural place in New Hampshire. And I think a few of the things that stood out to me in this dimension were, one, in the early years, I think my parents would keep telling me, look, so I'd say they're making fun of me because I put oil in my hair, or they're making fun of me because I have a bottu or bindi on my forehead. And they would sit down and they would explain to me, here's why we do these things. And here's what you can say to your classmates. Like, here's how you can explain to your classmates. Or they would like set something.
I think we lost her. Bad connection. The great technology challenges. Anyways, we'll come. What's that?
It looks like she's currently muted.
Yeah.
So she's still there.
I don't see her on my screen.
Mute.
Yes, Sucharita. Okay, hold on. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead now.
Hi, sorry. I had a technological challenge, but when I came back, it automatically muted me. Yeah, so sorry. The thing that I meant to say was just, so they would come into my classroom and they would talk to my classmates about, here's like a cultural appreciation day, and here's why like we wear a bottu, here's why we wear these certain clothes, here's why like we use turmeric, or like whatever else that like my classmates were coming up with, without saying, hey, you're saying these things to my daughter and that's bad. They would educate my class. And I think that worked really well for me through like my elementary school years, through like even high school. My teachers who taught religion classes, I would go talk to them. I would say, okay, well, I see these things in the textbook and those are wrong and misrepresenting, and we should have better textbooks. But also, since we're learning from these textbooks right now, let me come in, let me talk about this to all the students. Bring in other resources besides this textbook and let me educate my fellow students. And I think that was a very empowering experience, and something that like helped me feel like I was in a community where my friends and my teachers understood me, were giving me a voice, and like otherwise generally like helping me grow beyond a system that felt stacked against me in some ways. And I think in college, similarly, it's harder to have people come into classrooms, but in college, I was a member of Dartmouth's Hindu student organization, which is called Shanti. And we would work really hard to educate our fellow students and classmates and hold not just celebratory events, but also kind of educational events where people could learn about our culture. And we had like, come ask us anything about Hinduism days, where we would just sit there and answer people's questions. And I think kind of giving ourselves that voice was the way we were able to deal with that bullying and deal with those negative experiences we had. So yeah, that's what I had to say.
Okay, great. No, thank you for sharing that. Samyukta, you want to share your perspective? Samyukta is currently in high school. And we had some very interesting conversations a couple of days ago, actually yesterday. So please go ahead.
So Nikunj, you're going to have to unmute her.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
There's some background noise. But I think my experience was a lot different than Sucharita G's experience, because I grew up in California, where most of my school was Indian and most of the Indian population was Hindu, right? So everybody around me was like pretty accepting because they were part of our culture. And obviously in elementary school, there were people who were like, oh, how haven't you tried meat before? Like, do you know how it tastes? Are you curious about that? But I wasn't too affected by that. I was like, I don't want it, whatever. But there were some kids, I think, in my class who are Hindu, who were just like, okay, I can't take this. I'm really, really hungry. Let me just go eat some chicken or something without telling my parents, which was the more scary part for me. But I was just not affected by that much. But the one time I did realize that there was a lot of misinformation about Hinduism being spread was in 6th grade when we were studying about major world religions using the History Alive textbook. And I was really excited to learn about our culture from the school and to see how other people who weren't part of our culture learned about it as well. And the first thing I realized was that this was not an accurate representation of Hinduism at all. Most of this textbook was talking about the caste system, and I think they mentioned the word caste like more than 30 times in the textbook. And since the chapter was only 10 pages, I think that's what most kids got out of that chapter. And how they basically said that it defined Indian culture. It defined Indians' culture's social system came from Hinduism. I could have worded that better, but I think that's basically what they said. Like the 4 castes were the basis of Hinduism, and everything else was built off of that. And I think that's what perspective everybody else got of that Hinduism who weren't part of it. So it was grossly overrepresented in the textbook. And the first thing they talk about was origin of Hinduism, and they talk about in the 2nd BCE, the Aryan migration theory and everything. And they talked about how it was disputed, but the major thing they talked about was that lots of people believed that this is what happened. So I think that's also a major thing. And other than like the factual incorrectness, the way they presented the images and the pictures was vastly different than how they presented Greek culture later in the textbook. So in Greek culture, they showed amazing statues from Greek places of worship and everything. And they talked about Greek contributions to mathematics, science, and linguistics and art. But in Hindu culture, they didn't talk about how Aryabhatta contributed to astronomy or Ramanujan contributed to mathematics. There was none of that. There was only talking about our beliefs, which is amazing. Like they talk about like the Trinity, and they talked about Brahman. But I think the thing that connects most of students is how it affects them today, right? So they talked about how the Pythagoras theorem actually came from India and from Hindu mathematicians. Then it would have taught them a lot more than talking about from how a deva or devi looked. So I feel like that they could have represented that better. And in addition, the statues and the images were vastly different. So for Hinduism, when they showed a temple, it was a street temple with, I don't know, auto rickshaws in the background, and they could have
cows. Maybe some cows.
Yeah, so that too. And there's this like one kid randomly standing there, and it didn't represent like the architecture that was there in Hinduism. You know how like we don't even know how they built some of those temples in the back then, right? So I feel like that perspective that people got from the textbook was from a very etic perspective and not from how we actually believe in celebrate Hinduism. So since then I've seen a lot of like experiences like this, but I think this is the main starting point when I realized that Hinduism was misrepresented in schools.
Yeah, and not only that, right? It pervades through the one you mentioned about Siddhartha, the book we were talking about yesterday with Harman Hesse, right? How in the first few pages of that book, which is a recommended reading in many high schools, they talk about how Brahmins are so horrible and bad, right? Yeah, so it's like really amazing how it not just Hinduism class itself, but it's in literature, other places of literature and stuff like that. So
yeah, it's a required reading for our class, and it's pretty horrible. They show like Buddhism as an improvement over Hinduism, saying that Buddhism isn't casteist. We don't like discriminate against people, and it's pretty sad to see that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts. I think this is a great, powerful start to what we're going to be talking about today. So before we get to the panel, I wanted to share a quick presentation about what Hindu Parents Network really is and what we're trying to do. So if everybody can see my screen, I think, let me just blow it up into a presentation mode. Okay, so obviously, some of the concerns we have as parents is quality education, safe schools, bullying, Hinduphobia, which is, people who think that Hinduism is actually horrible and it needs to be eradicated. There's also lack of collective resources. A lot of times parents get confused in terms of how we get the resources to help kids develop pride in our culture. There are a lot of questions that they ask we sometimes don't have the answers for, or we don't know where to go for it. Similarly, all of the above, with trying to juggle multiple things in life, a lot of parents generally face a lot of stress, mental stress, physical stress. Add that to your job, your professional careers and stuff. There's a lot of stress in general, right? So sometimes parents are just saying, you know what, just do your studies. Don't worry about everything what others say, blah blah blah. And that has an impact on parents as well as on kids themselves. That's shown in a lot of surveys. So there's a survey by cyberbullying. Over 23% of Hindu kids from the ages of 12 to 17 get bullied due to their religion. That's a pretty big number. It's like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 kids get bullied based on their religion. And this is a sample of 5,000 students in the US. So it's a pretty telling sign of what happens in different schools. And you saw some examples that we talked about. In June of 2020, after the killing of George Floyd, there's a school district in Ohio, Olentangy School District, created a survey of how students felt in that school. And the survey was crazy because it had showed the amount of rampant racism, rampant discrimination that goes on in the name of, in the name of studies, in the name of education, amongst friends, but also amongst people who are not Hindus. So you see, for example, a few instances where kids of Hindu backgrounds said, like, I was a Tamil Hindu, I'm a Tamil Hindu, and they told me, go back to your country. You worship 33 million gods. Do you speak Indian, or things like that? Another kid was called Gorilla, and that person has felt like so horrible and has similar experiences for all these years. And then one guy actually wrote a really, really long message about how he felt. And as a practicing Hindu, he was called a cow worshiper, a dot head. Oh, only thing you eat is curry. All these different things, and all the great things about Hindu Dharma were just completely ignored. So you can see some real.
Nikunj bhai, sorry to interrupt you. Do you mind just full screening it? It looks like you're in presentation mode and not full screen mode. So some of it is blocked. We can't see some of it.
Interesting. Okay. Because let me try it. Give me a second. I'm going to try again. Can you guys see it now?
I think this is fine. If you keep it like this, it's fine. Yeah.
Okay, great.
No, now it's in presentation mode and it's not full screened. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not sure why that is. I'm not sure why that is the case.
I think this is fine, Nikunj bhai. Yeah.
Yeah, I apologize. No problem. So we'll talk about some of the psychological impacts of bullying. It's like very self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go through the slide. It goes from social isolation to feelings of shame, lower self-esteem, even worst case scenario, depression and suicide. This is a real problem, and we'll have the panelists talk about this a little later. We also, Hindu youth face a lot of Hinduphobia in schools. So in 2005, 2006, there was a massive issue in California where a lot of parents were concerned that the school districts and the school system in California was peddling Hinduphobia by teaching kids how Hinduism is horrible vis-a-vis other religions. And there's a book called Making Children Hinduphobic by Kundan Singh Ji and Krishna Maheshwari that talks about the whole issue in California. So I would highly recommend all of you read that. But one example I'll show you is basically there was a passage in there that said the Monkey King Hanuman loved Ram so much that it is said that he's present every time Ramayana is told. So look around, do you see any monkeys? Right? So this is a very snide remark against Hanumanji and against Hindu Dharma in general. Similarly, you can see there's an excerpt from a school district, South Brunswick textbook, South Brunswick, New Jersey. Without reading the fine print, I'm just going to summarize it for you. It says basically a few quotes that the Aryans practice a religion known as Brahmanism. Hinduism developed out of Brahmanism and influences for many cultures. The Jains reacted to Hinduism by breaking away from their own religion. And then at the beginning of each chapter, it talks about, like, if you were there, how would you feel? So in the case of Hinduism, they talk about, like, oh, you are like a child who wants to be a king or who wants to be a warrior, but only Aryans can be a warrior. How do you feel about that, right? So naturally, this feeling of guilt and shame is being introduced through the curriculum. Here is another text excerpt from a textbook in Georgia. And if you can see on the left, there's a long question, multiple choice question. There's a quote from Al-Baruni, a Muslim scholar, where he talks about how Hindus are basically, they are by nature reluctant in communication. They're haughty, foolish, vain, self-conceited, and stolid. Okay, and blah, 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 all kinds of things. They're also if you tell them great things about Persia, they will think that you are an ignoramus and a liar, right? And then it asks students to answer questions based on that pretty much that passage. So you can see how Hinduism is being portrayed and positioned. Similarly, on the right side, and you don't have to read the whole thing, it's very clear that they're comparing Hinduism and Buddhism together. What is highlighted? Caste, reincarnation, karma, moksha, but the first word that you see is caste. So someone will just think, oh, Hinduism is nothing but caste. In Buddhism, it's all talking about nirvana, talking about the benevolence of Buddha, blah, blah, blah. So as you can see, the comparison between different religions in a textbook makes essentially people feel that Hinduism is no good, and Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, etc., are improvements or rebellions against Hinduism. In addition, there's a widespread lack of what is Hinduism. So, or what are some of our symbols? So recently in New York, there was a bill that was going to essentially mandate that the swastika be taught as a hate symbol in all schools in New York State. And that's really horrible, because if you think about it, swastika is a very, very sacred symbol for Hindus. So as CoHNA basically had launched a campaign to stop this bill, so we worked with various community organizations to get this bill stalled. But the real deal is that this is actually happening in our backyard, right? And we're not even looking at this. Here's a testimony of a 14-year-old girl in Texas. And as you heard from Samyukta and Suchrita, similar experiences. She was sitting in 6th grade class, and there are a lot of these classmates and their teacher. Essentially, she feels that there's students talking about how scattered murmurs of how freaky Hindus worship elephants and monkeys. And then her teacher basically said, well, from what I understand, Hindus are all about their caste system, right? So the entire Hindu practice, tradition, etc., is reduced into basically caste, cows, and curry, as Sri Haji Malhotraji puts it. So we can see the bias that is against Hindu students. Imagine if your kid is sitting in this class and essentially, you get bullied. And bullying is not just about physical attacks, but it's also about making fun of someone's religion, making fun of the way they look, the way they act, things like that. But it doesn't stop in just high school. It goes on. So from schools, you can go to college, and this kind of morphs into a very different monster in college, essentially. So you have all these groups who have preconceived notions of Hinduism, and some of them are actually anti-Hindu, where they actually bring in protests, they bring in all kinds of essential activism on campus to show how bad Hinduism really is. So if you see some of these things, and excuse my display here because some of there's profane language here, but you can see, they use the nasty words for Hindus by using Om. They also use things like Brahmanism is poison, Kashmir is not part of India, it will never be, it never was, things like that. Hindu phobia doesn't exist, all these things. And then there's a thing about when parents love Modi, how do you talk to your parents if they love Modi? How do you react to them? Are they Hindu phobes? Are they right-wing extremists? Things like that. And this is what goes on in college. So if you think you're done with school, it's not over. It goes all the way to college. You can also see there is a group called Students Against Hindutva Ideology. They actually had a Twitter post that said the CAA is our Holocaust. I mean, imagine how they're comparing a law that is humanitarian in nature to Holocaust, right? And I can go on and on and on, but the point is these types of things have a deep impact on a lot of kids who are either in high school or in college. So what is Hindu Parents Network? So thinking about all these things, some of us decided to start something to bring parents together on a platform that allows for exchanges of ideas and resources. What do we want to do? We want to be better equipped on Hindu practices and current issues. So many of us are very good in mantras and shlokas and things like that, but we cannot connect those things to our current situations, whether it's Black Lives Matter or LGBTQ or some of the current issues around discrimination, racism, things like that. That's really, really important for kids nowadays. Also have a network of like-minded parents to rely upon in times of need. So a lot of times we don't know where to go. We don't know who to talk to. So having a network like that where people are concerned about these things, they come together, they bring resources, is extremely critical. We also want to ensure a support system for Hindu youth in schools and middle schools. And I can go on, and there's another presentation we'll be making for our next session about Hinduism in school textbooks. So you just saw a little excerpt today, but we're going to have a full session on that. But we want to make sure that our youth in schools, high schools and middle schools, and even in college, have a support system of parents who say, you know what, I got your back. Don't worry. If there are issues you're facing, I will get to that. And we want to also make sure that the ground level, the grassroots level change than percolates above. And of course, be a voice for change, as I said, for Hindu Dharma in schools, universities, and other areas. So not only just your child facing bullying, but also other kids who may be facing bullying, and kids who are younger than that who will eventually see these types of curricula in school textbooks. Some objectives. We have, Hindu Students Council, which has chapters in various universities, and we're establishing chapters in schools. So helping expand that so that youth have a support network for themselves, equipping parents to better engage with their kids on various types of discussions, whether it's bullying and prejudice, asking the right questions, parenting best practices, how to take our history and heritage and connect that to today's issues, improving the portrayal of Hindu Dharma in school textbooks, providing resources like mentorships and stuff like a big brother, big sister type of program, taking educational tours to India, developing a greater dialogue with school boards and administrators to make sure that our voice is heard. And we've been doing this for the past few months with different types of school districts. And of course, encouraging more parents. The only way we can make change is if we show up and run for school boards, local offices, PTAs, and things like that. So encouraging parents to get there. And we have some parents here who are running for school boards and who have experience there too today. So these are some of the objectives of what the Hindu Parents Network is going to be. So in the next few weeks, we're going to be launching our website, hinduparentsnetwork.org. It's not up yet, so if you type that in, you're not going to get anything. But over the next few weeks, we're going to have a website. But we call everybody to join us. If you are interested in volunteering, you can send an email to info@cohna.org. So COHNA.org, info@cohna.org, or you can type into the chat here and essentially let us know. We would love to have you as a volunteer in our team to make a difference and join our efforts. So I know I went through the presentation real quick because I wanted to make sure we get to the panel. We'll come back to the Q&A as far as these things are concerned at the end of the panel. So for now, I wanted to introduce our esteemed panel. First, Dr. Jyoti Mattam. Jyoti ji is a psychiatrist in Alpharetta, Georgia, and has been involved in a lot of Hindu activities locally. And it's a pleasure having you, Jyoti ji. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Nikunj.
My pleasure. Suresh Krishnamurthy ji. Suresh ji is Board of Directors member for Coalition of Hindus of North America, and also very active in the Atlanta area, and has been working with us since one of the founding members of CoHNA, working with us since 6 months now. And it's been a pleasure working with Suresh ji. Looking forward to our dialogue today. And last but not least, Ravi Jaishankar. Ravi is currently residing in Colorado. He's a former president and current board member of Hindu Students Council. He is also a mental health coordinator in a small nonprofit in Breckenridge that works with the patients with substance abuse and mental health. And he's had a lot of experience himself previously with the National Alliance of Mental Illness, working with students, working with youth, and working with adults on mental health issues. So welcome, Ravi, as well. So thank you all for joining. Maybe I'll start with Jyoti ji. Jyoti ji, we talked a lot about bullying, right? You saw Samyukta and Sucharita talk about a few things. What are some of the symptoms of bullying, if you want to highlight that?
Hello, namaste everyone. As Nikunj said, I'm an adult psychiatrist practicing currently in Alpharetta, Georgia. I do see kids from ages 11 and until up to the age of around 70. So first, let me start with the definition of bullying. What is bullying is basically it is an intent to either harm or intimidate or coerce somebody that they perceive as weak. And who do these people or where it happens? It can happen anywhere. It can happen in urban, rural, suburban, any setting. It can happen in schools, it can happen in workplace, it can happen in internships, it can happen even when we are shopping, either in Kroger or Walmart or somewhere, making comments and obscene gestures. And who generally do that? Some of the signs or who is doing it. There are two varieties of people that generally do that. Generally, we talk about kids when we talk about bullying. First group is the popular kids in school. They are the ones that have a huge following. They are powerful, either physically or intellectually. Sometimes abilities do play a and groups the basic followers of the first group, even though they are not, they don't generally initiate any bullying, but they are the followers, and they do cause a lot of damage in doing so. And who are the major people that generally affected by this bullying? In general, we do see a lot of gender identity disorder patients, like lesbians, gay, bisexuals, and also the racial wise blacks and browns and Latinos, and also American natives like American Indians and Alaskan natives. They seem to be at the receiving end. So what kind of things they do, like who are the people that they bully in general, are the people that they perceive as little different, either by looks wise, either the symbols they wear, or they recently migrated, like immigrant kids like us, and also weak, who are not really able to defend themselves. And sometimes, like the term I use is a very normal term, like nerds, who are pretty much like toppers in their class, but they have very few other activities other than academic activities. And how do they like to bully? As I said, it can be verbal, it can be emotional, it can be physical. And nowadays we are seeing a lot of social media, internet related bullying. So I generally tell my parents or kids that come with this kind of issue is how much time the kid is spending on the social media, or what kind of platforms they are on. Are they age appropriate? Those are the things sometimes we need to really look into. So what are the signs that they display once these kids, they get bullied? Some things that parents should keep an eye is any change in behavior, either loss of books or loss of any kind of school related things, and then any destruction or any kind of bodily damage, or the kid is not actually paying attention, their grades are slipping, they are not eating, or they are eating like binge eating, they are socially isolation, and they are not paying much attention to what is going on around them. Before, a kid used to love to go to parties, suddenly they are like, no, I'm not going to come. So these are the kind of things that we need to look into. Having said that, what are the things we need to look into? The kids who are bullying, those are the people that suddenly get a lot of money in their position. They are skipping school, they are getting a lot of disciplinary actions at school, they are getting into fights, their grades are slipping, they started talking about drug use, alcohol, smoking, marijuana. These are the kind of things we need to look into. So, and having said that, what is the how we address these things? Not every bullied kid is going to display psychological symptoms, but when parents do notice any of this above behavior, I would advise them to sit with the kid, discuss in detail, and keep an open communication with the school, like school teachers and any of the common friends the kid has, because kids know a lot about what's going on in the school. And thereafter, if whether they need a psychological counseling or not, or treatment, that comes little later.
Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yes, it's my pleasure. So no, that's really good because I think the verbal, emotional, physical, there are three types of bullying, as you had mentioned. And I think that there are categories of each of those that we can think about, like, verbal bullying, which is very easy, but there's also certain types of other bullying, right? And I'm going to come to Ravi for that actually. Ravi, like, we've obviously worked in HSC so much and we have heard so many stories. Maybe you want to share some examples or your thoughts on kind of the emotional bullying part, right? Verbal bullying is easy, you're a cow worshiper, or like you stink as a Hindu, but there's also that emotional bullying, right? Maybe you want to share a few thoughts on what you think of that, and then I'll come to another question that I have for you.
Yeah, sure. Namaste, everybody. My name is Ravi. I'm very happy to be here. There's a few things that I'd like to touch upon. I really want to thank Sucharita and Samyukta for both sharing their personal experiences. I would say that my personal experience fell kind of in between the two, having grown up in New Jersey, where there's a significant amount of diversity, again, a significant Hindu population. I really like Sucharita's example of her parents, where her parents went in and essentially did advocacy work, the kind of advocacy work that CoHNA is trying to do and Hindu Students Council is trying to do. That is, just one of the best ways of showing your kids that you love them and support them through this, and also breaking down the stereotypes, the stigmas, all the negativity that kind of is latent and kind of in the background. Nikunj, you mentioned caste, cows, and curry, as Shri Rajiv Malhotraji coined that phrase, describing how people see Hindus. Certainly, if you look at Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, if you know that classic American movie from several decades ago, that is kind of that and other media representations and textbook representations is what creates the image of the Hindu in the mind of the American public, essentially. And that kind of, not only affects the upbringing of folks that grow up in America, but it also affects, further forward, in career aspects, in other aspects of life. So I wanted to touch upon, before answering your question, Nikunj, I wanted to touch upon two primary things, kind of at the personal level, at the human level, and then at the civilizational level. Where does bullying and what does that look like in both of those contexts? So from the personal level, there is something called the ACEs exam, Adverse Childhood Experiences exam, which is growing in popularity and growing in clinical use, which basically shows the level of trauma and the level of emotional hurt that essentially a person has gone through, whether they are a direct experiencer of a certain type of emotional trauma, whether they witness it happening, and the several impacts that it has on physical health, on educational opportunities, on career, and on just general well-being and overall just quality of life. So in my perspective, both the person doing the bullying and the person being bullied is having, respectively, adverse childhood experiences. In order to bully, one has to, be living in an adverse childhood environment where they're not getting a positive form of love or attention or nurturing from their parents, or they're having some other negative experience elsewhere where that is being projected onto somebody else who is then withstanding those adverse childhood experiences through that bullying, which then affects children, with that beautiful list that Nikunj you had kind of summarizing the effects from kind of one end of the spectrum all the way to the other end of the spectrum. So that's, from a personal perspective, especially for Hindus, it's relevant in the ways that Sucharita and Samyukta have mentioned. But really where that comes from is the issue of difference anxiety, is what Shri Rajiv Malhotraji has also coined a phrase, basically saying that there is a civilizational asymmetry of power, that they're separate, that there are different types of powers that civilizations have, and that Western civilization specifically has really monopolized on a particular economic, social, and just overall force, where the Western perspective is seen as kind of the lens, as the gold standard and the lens through which everything has to be looked through. So when there is a non-monotheistic, when there is a essentially hierarchical structure between the divine and the human in play, then there's significant anxiety caused in the West towards Hindus. Of course, the West is also expert at appropriating the things that Hindus have created. For example, the yoga tradition, which is $1 billion industry in the West, and of course, mindfulness, which is taken from Vipassana and Sakshi Bhava from the Buddhist and Hindu traditions, respectively. And there's a lot more examples of what's been appropriated, but essentially, if the West is looking at Hindus as, caste cows and curry, worshiping these demonic goddesses like Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom, which is the way that they portray Kali Mata, that also has its trickle down and percolating effect on the psyche of the Hindu. And how do you address both of these? In order to address the ACEs component, the adverse childhood experiences component, psychotherapy, which is essentially accepting yourself in an unconditional way, finding self-love and self-respect and self-confidence through the process of confronting your feelings that have been buried for so long, which is directly connected to the next part, which is decolonization and anti-racism work. So for example, you see Black Lives Matter as a movement, as an anti-racism movement, doing significant work socially, but it's also an emotional and psychological process of unfolding and healing the traumas of being Black, which we don't need to get into in this, we can't. But certainly, what are the traumas and emotional difficulties of being raised as a Hindu in a Western environment, in a predominantly white environment where white supremacy and the Western lens is the primary method of understanding Hinduism and presenting Hinduism. What does that decolonization work look like? What does it mean to develop a healthy pride, a healthy sense of identity that does not, get stepped on like a doormat, like I was used to, like perhaps others of us can relate to, getting those boundaries, encroached on and violated. What does it look like to be able to stand up for oneself and not let the word Hindu be something shameful? Because for me, it was, I felt ashamed saying that I'm Hindu because I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know that it was much, much more than just some superstitious practices that I was exposed to at a temple. And so in addition to the bullying, I also felt a significant kind of stifling of my whole self, of my wholeheartedness, because I simply did not understand my tradition, my culture in a deep enough way to represent it and to be confident about it. So I think that there's a dual aspect when one is Hindu. There isn't just the aspect of, confronting, meeting, and going through the emotional hurts that we all carry. I mean, we all have, our mental health issues, which are on a spectrum. We have some good days, we have some bad days, but there's a deeper part of us that holds on to shame and fear and sorrow and guilt, which we never truly know how to look at because simply society is allergic to emotions. Simply society does not know how to feel emotions in a conscious enough way to let them go and to heal. So that's a universal thing. But as Hindus, on top of that, there is the shame and the guilt and the fear of expressing oneself as a Hindu in an open, in an unapologetic, in a healthy, prideful, whole way, that where additional work has to be done to learn, to delve into ourselves, to process, to just figure out who we are, where we are, not just as a human, but also as a Hindu, and then basically give that to others. So, in a way, Sucharita's parents are a wonderful model for being able to go into a school and talk about their tradition. I know that I would have been scared to do that in the past. It is really through Hindu Students Council when I joined when I was in college, and then my years after that, that I developed a healthy understanding and a healthy pride of what it meant to be Hindu, to be able to overcome some of these aspects that I struggled with as a youth. So
absolutely, I think that's really important. What I wanted to, building off on top of yours, Ravi, I wanted to ask Sureshji, as a Hindu parent, and we've had this conversation before, we just had that discussion with the Atlanta school, one of the Gwinnett County school boards, right? As a Hindu parent, what are your thoughts in terms of how to approach this issue, framing this issue, coming to this, you're talking to your daughter, right? She has some feedback for you. How are you engaging? How did you engage with her when she was, when she was younger, and even today, of course?
Namaste, everybody. Thank you, Nikunj, for putting this together. Jyotiji and Ravi have given a great background on the perspective from a professional and from people who have seen it from that side. I wanted to share the experience as a parent. Now, if you grew up in India and you come here and then you have a child here and your child is growing up here, the first big, huge, humongous lesson that I learned was schools here are nothing, absolutely nothing like the schools we went to. We are, in a sense, used to revering our teachers. The teacher can never be wrong most of the time. Here, that is not the case. So one of my big learnings when we were working with our daughter, and I come from a very traditional background. I'm well familiar with the Indian roots as well as Western culture, having gone to IIT, having spent time here. So I found I did a lot of wrong things. Literally, as parents, we did a lot of wrong things. So
Sureshji, can you speak up a little bit, just a little?
Yeah, sorry. Okay. So, so basically what I'm sharing here is some of the mistakes, or what I would say is, if I could do it all over, how would I do it differently? I think the biggest thing I would say to all the parents who are on this call, listen to your children. They're not faking it. They're not telling you things. They're not overreacting. They are not, making a scene. And as Indian parents, we probably fit the stereotype as long as they're getting good grades, who cares? Well, I found that their emotional experience is very, very tough. The reason for that, and this was a much later learning for me personally as a parent, the reason for that is they are often tokenized in school as the only representative. So when I listened to Sucharita talk about that, it resonated with me simply because they are the only person in school who's brown or who comes from an Indian background. How does that result in tokenization? So I'll give you an example. They're discussing a passage to India, right? Literature, passage to India, it's one of the reading material. There is this built-in assumption that your child, who's the only child of Indian origin in class, knows all about it. Imagine the pressure that your child is in class when that happens. They come back to you at home and say, hey, what is this? Why am I being expected? Why am I expected to know about this just because I'm Indian? The tendency of us as parents is, well, just work hard, figure it out. It's okay. But what we miss, and what I tend to miss as a parent, and now I'm better at it, is the fact that they feel that there's a spotlight shining on them, not because of what they know, but because of what they don't know, right? They are expected to know this, they don't know this. So that's one huge issue that I think our daughter was trying to tell us, and we were not listening really well. So it took us a while to kind of get around it. So that's one big, huge, humongous thing. The other big difference that I saw as the way in which your child is viewed in school versus others is Americans have a view of Indians. Unfortunately, that view is Priyanka Chopra and people like that, right? So they look at your child with the bindi or with the hair in braids and they go, why aren't you like Priyanka Chopra? She's Indian too. What's the big deal with you? Why are you so different? Right? All of a sudden, now the child is now being asked to look like something she may not even want to look like. Okay, so be sensitive to that point where, it's not like they don't know about India. They just have a view of India that's not yours, right? And the most important thing, and this is easily the most important thing I've heard from multiple people about this, is parents who have come from India, who become parents here, who have a child here. The biggest difference is the fact that your child in school is all alone. They're literally alone because they have nobody who looks, talks, speaks like them. In fact, it's a wonder Sucharita survived high school. It's amazing that she survived high school with the poise that she shows, because that is the, so imagine the reverse. If you were in school, when you were in school in India, for example, imagine if there was an American kid in that class and she was the only American kid in that class. Imagine how she would have felt. That's how your child is feeling in the American school here. They speak like Americans, they eat like Americans, they don't look like Americans. And that is a huge, huge thing that we have to be sensitive to a parent. So, I mean, if I had to make those points, those are my three big takeaways from my experience as a parent. Is one, listen to your children. They're not making it up, right? They are genuinely feeling distressed in school. Two, it is not just about academics. Academics is a very, very small part of their life. And three, they are tokenized because they're the only person who looks like that. And there's an assumption because they're Indian, their parents are Indian, they know everything about India. And they don't. And they're put on a spot and they're constantly being put on that spot. It is stressful. It's not necessarily bullying, but it is extremely stressful, right? And we as parents have to do better at adapting to that stress and supporting them through it.
Absolutely. And that's a good point. Now I'm going to turn a little bit differently, because there are a lot of people here who actually know that their kids are not the only Hindus in the school, right? So in the case of Sucharita, she was probably the only one. We have Shubhodeep and others who are like just one of many, one of basically maybe two brown kids in the entire like school or class, right? However, if you look at Edison Township, if you look at some of the townships that in your area, Sureshji, or if you look at some of the townships in the Bay Area, right? There are a lot of Hindu kids. However, what ends up happening is that there is still a different type of bullying that goes on. There's no physical threat, right? You're part of that environment which you have people around you. However, as I have noticed working with kids in HSC, there's also these microaggressions, right? These smaller assumptions about your identity, that you either know everything or that this group of Hindus are just like that. So Jyotiji, coming to you, those types of sort of subtle cues of bullying, right? They're not necessarily overt bullying. It's not like a guy or girl who's beating someone up or who's just saying you're a Hindu, this Hindu, this Hindu, this. But the system, right, itself, where it's actually teaching subtle things about India, subtle things about Hindus, and it's institutionalizing that prejudice, right? That has a psychological impact on the way kids imbibe that, because when they go home, right, they're learning something different. But when they come to class, they're doing something different. And what's worse is what I've seen among some of the kids is that the Hindu kids who don't know much, right, they'll turn around and start feeling guilty and say, well, looks like my religion is a bunch of Brahmanistic, Hindutva, casteist people, right? And that itself has a very strong impact. So I want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, there are a lot of microaggressions. Like one thing I constantly hear from my, I live in Alpharetta, as I said before, which I generally see at least one Indian patient a day. We pretty much live like in a Indian township here. So having said that, lot of kids, they complain on parents because we sometimes, as Sureshji just mentioned, we want them to be 100% Indians at home and they need to be 100% Americans at school. So that is one thing the kids always complain to me. The number one complaint they tell is they don't let me be myself. Second thing, really let me do anything for me to be American, especially when we are talking about high schoolers. As Sureshji said again, academics. How much is your GPA? How much is your SAT? How much is your SAT? What schools you are applying? What about dating? What about communication skills? What about your essays? What about having a lot of friends that come from different backgrounds? And I have to tell you one incident that because we guys are also talking about this Black Lives Matter movement. My kid suddenly came and asked me one thing about positive thing that I heard from her to me about Hinduism is that Mahabharat actually has a bisexual person who is Sikandi. And she said, do you know that? I said, yes. And she said, oh my God, Hinduism is very open. Why do people think we are restricted? I said, people do not really read Mahabharat, do not really read Ramayana, do not really read Bhagavad Gita. And as I told you, Nikunj, I recently heard an incident in one of the Georgia schools that one of the professors, and this is a college, in college setting, this professor made a comment that Sita Mata got pregnant while she was stayed with Ravan in Lanka. And the kid went and fought with her, but she never accepted that openly in the class. She did accepted privately with him. So sometimes kids get really shocked. This is coming from professors, and they don't know how to counter these incidents because they do get scared about what happens, what are the ramifications if I go and complain, if I go to my parents, are they going to let me fight it over? Is it like my school is going to do any bad things? You know, these are the things sometimes, even though the kid want to do, we as parents, I do understand parents do think broad and we have their best in the mind and we want our kids to succeed. Sometimes we need to be a little supportive and we want them to be all-round Americans, because I'm going to not use Indians anymore because they are Americans. My kids repeatedly tell me. And whatever they decide, at some point, I'm going to support them in whatever the way best it is. But to do that, we have to educate our kids, you know, in our epics. We are talking about Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, or the Upanishads, or the Vedas, who learned Rudra, or, you know, Namakam, Chamakam. The God is there everywhere. That is the beauty of Hinduism. The God is everywhere. God doesn't belong to one jati, varna, sect, or color, or gender, or identity. So that kind of environmental friendly religion, I would say only Hinduism. So we need to basically install a lot of these very simple concepts from beginning, like when they are kids, so that they can fight effectively when they get into later stages in their life. And the question you asked, what happens, how do we see? A lot of kids don't really come with the concept of bullying. By the time they come to me, they are at a level where they are clinically depressed, getting panic attacks, not able to sleep, started going out, doing things that are little scary for the parents, you know, alcohol, drugs, smoking, associating themselves with the wrong crowds, gangs. And this can happen on both sides. As Raviji said, both bullies and the people who got bullied, they both end up with having a lot of psychological mental health issues for a long time. And some of these things unfortunately end up with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that sometimes needs a longer term treatment. We are talking about years and years. So it is a good idea to pay attention to the kid. And basically, one more point I want to touch. We are talking about caste, cows, and curry. So I just want to tell a brief, this happened 2-3 times to me. So this is a little sensitive topic to Indians, but before we jump to calling other people, oh, you are bullying my kid, think about what we are doing. So this couple of kids came to me, and the minute they walk into, I can actually say, hey, I can smell. So I simply said, very nice smell, nice sambar. And actually another one, rasam. I'm from South India. So the minute I said that, the parents got a little shocked, and they were like, oh my God, do you spell? Because that is exactly my kid actually coming home and telling me every day that the other kids are calling him, you are smelling. So sometimes we have to take a step back and re-evaluate, like what is going on, like, is there anything we can do from parents standpoint to get our kids' life better in this American setting. Kids, having, when we are cooking, making sure that the clothes are washed, and personal hygiene, very, very important, personal hygiene. And many kids, and when they are getting into puberty, they start having these smelly issues, which is normal, very medical, normal thing. Deodorant, use of deodorant. Sometimes I'm not a big fan of makeup, but we have to let go of some things to gain certain things. So these are very, very practical things that I generally let counselors deal with them. But when I see an issue, I actually bring it up to the parents and ask them to sit with the school counselors, and sometimes the teachers, and sometimes ask them, hey, take the kid to one of your American, white or black, whoever, like a mainstream American person, and ask them for suggestions. These are extremely practical things, extremely useful for our kids to survive the emotional trauma they go through schooling, both middle school, high school, elementary, colleges in this country.
Yeah, and I'll tell you something that I have a 9-year-old, and I'm learning a lot of things that I've not learned before. Right, I went to school here, but still I'm learning so many things, and there are things that we don't even realize. Right, there are things that are happening out there that we don't realize. And a small example is, like, there was a kid who was bullying her. She and it was just small kids, and she was like 6 years old, and she wouldn't talk. She stopped talking. And she would, every time she's like, I don't want to take the bus anymore, right? So you start to see that pattern develop. And she was not mentioning anything. And she was saying, oh, he's making fun of me later on to somebody else. He's making fun of me for being like this, being, my name is Mira and this and that, right? So she's like making fun of. So then you realize that, okay, she's being bullied because who she is, right? So we have to sort of ask those questions. And I really agree with you, being practical, right? You have to let go of certain things to have some things. One of the things that I want to share is that a lot of kids, parents who have kids are using Instagram. Okay, it's a big communication. Yes. Facebook is called old book. In the 13 to 15-year-olds, it's all called old book versus Facebook. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because there is a Instagram, other social media channels, there's a big thing called doxing. Doxing essentially, exposes your identity and subjects you to hate attacks on social media. So they'll post your profile, post your address, where you live, who your parents are, all kinds of identities. And that's a very interesting, dangerous form of bullying that we now see. And in my times, I didn't see that. And now that's happening. So a lot of kids get silenced because what happens is they want to speak up against injustices or against all the negative portrayals. But because they are fearful of this happening to them, right? It's very important that we recognize this phenomenon. So when kids talk to you about being on social media, talk to them about, okay, what are they doing? Who are they talking to? What are the concerns they have? Open communication is really, really important. So, I want to stop here. I think we have about 20 minutes, and I want to thank the panelists, but we're not going anywhere. We're going to go into Q&A. So at this point, what I want to do is I'm going to open up everyone's lines, but obviously we have a lot of people. We have about 65 people on call now. So what I'm going to do is, if you want, you can start typing your questions in the chat, and then we can come back to the panelists. So I'll give everybody a few seconds to start typing your questions in the chat. Any questions you may have?
Yeah, Nikunj bhai, as the questions are coming in, I just want to thank Shubhodeep ji and Uday ji for their contributions in the chat earlier and everybody else. I actually changed my name. My full name is Ravindra J. Shankar. I changed it to RJ, just 2 letters, when I was very young because people were making fun of my name. You know, the coconut oil in the hair, the foods, the smells from the foods. Now, these are all things that are catching on in the West, and they're patenting them and they're selling them. The turmeric chai lattes are, you know, all the rage. So putting coconut oil and other oils in the hair is also picking up. So these are all things that I think that we need to do some work on. As Udayji said, there is intergenerational trauma that we as Hindu Americans inherit. Intergenerational trauma from the you know, centuries of colonization that we have withstood and suffered from, both from the British Raj and from the Mughal colonizers prior. And this is something that deeply affects our own ability to speak up for ourselves, to stand up for ourselves, to defend our pride, to identify in a strong enough way where we're at a level playing field amongst the others. And if we continue to ignore this intergenerational trauma and remain meek, remain quiet, remain misinformed about our own Hindu heritage, and kind of just continue that long lineage of negativity and just unresolved emotional pain, we are never really going to get anywhere unless we really do the hard work of decolonizing our identity and really learning about who we truly are, and then being able to express that in a holistic way, without attacking, without anger, but with a certain sense of strength, which comes from being vulnerable, learning how to touch our hearts, and learning how to be in touch with our feelings, decolonizing, and then coming from a place of strength, which then, of course, if we show our kids that, we can solve this whole thing completely.
No, very good. And I think that's an excellent point. That's the first question, in fact, that we got, saying, okay, how are we going to train parents to use American lingo, right? And essentially, like, a lot of times you see Hindu parents using words like leftists or secularists and stuff like that. And sometimes they even use words like, yeah, I am right wing, right? These words have very different meanings in America than you have it in India. If you say I'm a nationalist, it's very different than saying a nationalist in America, right? So avoiding those words is going to be very important. And I'm glad that question was asked, because that is the type of work that we're going to be working, like trying to do some workshops and potentially partnering with Hindu Students Council, where we get these questions from kids, right? And coming up with a curriculum that says, okay, here are the words, do not say those words. Or another workshop that we're thinking about is how to speak about political things with kids from a Hindu perspective. Because a lot of parents don't have access to information like, oh, Black Lives Matter. They just think, oh, this is a garbage movement, you know, oh, it's like a bunch of like thugs doing stuff. No, it's not. I mean, it's very shocking to tell your kid that, because on one side you talk about dharma, on the other side you're saying this. It's like a conflicting message. So we're going to be coming up with some tools and resources, particularly on that. Now, let's come back. Another question was, somebody had asked, it is important to get these stories related to Hindu community through our meetings, but how do we get them out to non-Hindu communities? So Surajji, any thoughts from your side? How do we get like all these stories about, you know, great stories related to our community to a non-Hindu audience? Yes, I need to ask you, sorry, and me.
Sorry. Thank you. A couple of things. I mean, to go back to just a quick point on this communication bit and how to present it. You know, one of the things that we as parents, or at least me as a parent, I think I might have failed to do well, is we tend to make the kids very Indian at home, and then they don't really have the toolkit to go describe that to Americans in school. And one of the things I'll give you a practical example, was my daughter, who's now, you know, she's in college, and so the conversation was about, you know, arranged marriage, this whole series that was happening, and the light bulb went off when I said, look, don't think of arranged marriage as some kind of a casteist, some kind of a Hindu thing, nothing of that sort. if you look at Tinder, if you look at any dating application, or if you look at any form of dating whatsoever, all you're really looking for are some standard markers, right? If you say you are a particular type of person, then you expect a certain marker. If you went to Yale, then there's a certain marker about you that tells you something about somebody who you don't know. So or for example, when they talk about, how do I deal with the fact that I'm the only one who's different? Well, the answer is, well, how come all Indians don't look like you? Well, all Jewish people don't wear a yarmulke either, and we are perfectly okay with that. All Christian people don't go around wearing a cross on their around their a chain of a cross around their necks. This is just like that. So I think we have to empower our kids to use language that doesn't necessarily reflect Hinduism the way we would reflect it, because I think that is an essential conflict. As parents, we have certain ideas about how Hinduism should be portrayed. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for our kids. It just doesn't. When we try to talk about the Bhagavad Gita at school, eyes glaze over. They have no idea. They have no intentions of knowing anything about that. So we have to come up with language that presents Hinduism in a way that an American can appreciate without necessarily looking like you're this orthodox, fuddy-duddy, stuck in the mud kind of person. And that's a work in progress. As parents, we constantly have to do that. And that was my big takeaway, was how do I translate my hardcore spiritual learnings? I mean, I can chant the Rudram, Chamakam, etc., but that is not going to register with the parent of an American child who I'm talking to at a PTA meeting. How do I present Hinduism in a way where I don't denigrate it, but at the same time, I kind of position it as it is just like anything else. It's like being Jewish. It's like being Muslim. It's like being Christian. Not everybody is exactly the same way. It's okay for us to be slightly different. Just because I'm a Hindu doesn't mean I have to look like and act like every other Hindu everywhere. It's different, right? But we have some common beliefs. And that is the language we need to develop. And part of HPN's goal is to come up with that kind of language that allows us to present Hinduism in neutral ways that doesn't look like we're just a bunch of creepy old guys who are doing creepy old things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Now, it's interesting question came in saying that someone from Georgia, and these are serious issues, but how come we never hear about these in our social circles? So how come they haven't heard about these issues, right? My kids are young, but never hear about these. So I want Sucharita, actually. I know she's not technically a panelist, but given her experience, I want her to answer that question.
Thank you, Nikunj Bhai. So I think there's one main thing that we need to understand, and I think this is true of everyone, all your kids from like about 4th grade until they're done with college and have really matured into serious adults. And the biggest struggle for kind of a young person in America, Hindu or not, is this desire to fit in. And it's not just a desire to fit in with their immediate class, like which might have a lot of other Hindus or a lot of other brown people or whatever, but like to fit in with this idea of what an American teenager is supposed to be like, right? So that's what we all want to be. We all want to be the perfect American teenager. As Hindus, most of us already start out with one major disadvantage, where most of us are brown. We don't fit the perfect American teenager model because the perfect American teenager is white. If you watched any TV show ever, you see this. So we have this one big quote unquote disadvantage that we need to overcome in order to fit this model. The other disadvantages we have as Hindus is we are Hindu. We don't celebrate the same festivals. We have different cultural identities. We dress differently. We like eat differently. We have so these are all things that make it harder for a Hindu teenager to fit in. Now there's a big problem with this, because the number one problem is, as I think Sureshji pointed out very wisely, most of us were born here, like a second generation, like Hindus, like we were born here. We're just like all of our classmates in a lot of dimensions. I was born in New York. I grew up in New Hampshire. I can speak the language in their accent. I use the same vocabulary. The thing that makes us very different from our classmates is that our parents are not like their parents. And I think this becomes a very huge internal struggle for the American Hindu. Because of course we love our parents. Like, they care for us, they're there for us, we love them, they love us, we know this. And yet it's kind of the thing that's keeping us from reaching our goal of fitting in with everyone else. And I think this manifests in a lot of different ways, especially at younger ages. I think it manifests as things like when Nikunj Pai mentioned that his daughter was getting bullied, but like he kind of found out about it from like somebody else, like she was talking to somebody else. The same thing happened to me when I was a kid. I was getting bullied in school, badly enough, in fact, because this was right after 9/11, that they called a school-wide parental meeting about it. And my mom had to find out that they had called a school-wide parental meeting about how some kid bullied me from my friend's mother because I never came home and told her. Because I felt like me telling her was me saying, hey, Mom, people in school are treating me badly because of you. It sounded like I was blaming it on her, or I was ashamed of her, or I was kind of like, I didn't want her to feel bad for me having to go through what I was going through. And I think that in the younger ages keeps a lot of children from talking to their parents about it. As they get older, they haven't built that rapport with their parents. And things in school kind of turn around. My mother tells the story of how I came home in 6th grade once because there were school dances. And in 6th grade, school dances meant boys and girls were asking each other to the dance and asking each other out. And my parents were not fans of that because they came from a very traditional Indian background. And so they kind of were explaining to me at home why, like, they thought this was a bad idea, but you're like old enough, like if you want to make a decision that's different, we can talk about it, whatever. I decided I didn't want to go, but I went home and I went to school and told my friends, like my parents told me they don't want me to go to the dance. And my friends told me, oh my God, we hate your parents. They're literally the worst. So I came home and told my mom, my friends hate you. They think you're the worst parent. They think you're like worse than Cinderella's stepmother. Like, you won't let me go to the dance, right? Like, direct parallel there. Cinderella's stepmother is evil because she wouldn't let her go to the ball. My parents are equally evil because they wouldn't let me go to the dance. And I think that side of it gets worse. As you go older, there's this thing kind of driven in Hindu students that the thing that's keeping you from fitting in is your parents. And that means they're bad. They're evil. You have to separate yourselves from them. You have to kind of disown the things that they care about because they're holding you back. And I think a combination of all of these things, everything from kind of feeling like you don't want to hurt their feelings and you don't want to tell them this is their fault, all the way to I'm actually ashamed of my parents, or like I want to disown my parents, they're holding me back. That range of things is kind of what comes between a Hindu student expressing to their parents what they're going through. And of course, we all know the Indian cultural things for why parents might not want to tell their other parents that their kids are struggling. So I think all of that keeps open dialogue from happening in our community.
No, and that is definitely true. And what I also think that we are sometimes too high on ourselves, just because it's like, oh, well, I don't know, so it's not there, right? So it's like that ostrich mentality. You bury your head in the sand, pretending nothing around happens, right? Just 6 months ago, I didn't know many things in life, right? And I've been doing Hindu activism for the past 22 years, since I was in college, right? So you learn. I mean, this is part of life. Everything you learn, even today, yesterday, you'll learn. So we have to keep our open mind saying, okay, just because I did not know something and I know something, I need to take action on it. So first comes shock and then comes acceptance, right? So we have to keep that in mind. And that shock is very important. So thank you for that. Actually, there's a question for Jyoti ji. Someone asked, and I'm a parent to two twins, 8-year-olds.
Yes,
who went to
I
school.
read that question.
Yes, so please go ahead.
So this is a little deeper issue, ma'am. So my advice is, I don't really want to give you advice over a kind of a social media platform. So having said that, we do have emotions. When somebody comes and talks bad about us, we react very quickly. So, and that is the reason when I am talking about definition of bullying, I said it has to be repetitive. It is not like a snappy one-time thing. It needs to be like a repeated thing that happens from the same person with the same issue. So my advice to you is sit with your kids and explain to them. It is a simple thing. Where do we get our protein? We eat a lot of lentils, we eat a lot of fruits, we drink a lot of milk, and so many other varieties of sources of protein. Simple answer.
Absolutely. And my daughter gets that all the time. She's the only vegetarian in her class. And by the way, her class has a lot of Indian people. So it's also really strange because people are like, well, that person's Indian, that person eats chicken. What's wrong with you? Right? Do you have a problem? You know, what's the issue here, right? So that you face that. And I think that's a really important part to teach your kids and be proud of that.
And one thing I repeatedly tell my people who come to see me or seek advice is growing up in a diversified environment is always a good thing. That means you are not with just whites, just blacks, just Latinos, just Hindus. Unfortunately, some of the subdivisions and schools are 100% Hindu now, which sometimes I discourage too. So either it is colleges, either it is high schools, or we are talking about soccer, we are talking about sports, we are talking about music classes, having that kind of a diversified, just like having a portfolio is so important in finance, that is important in social situations also. So if we are specialized, unless we go to a really career path of having a extremely specified and specific route to do our career, we need to have that diversified environment is very good for the kid. There is a saying in India that we need a village to raise a kid. That means it is not just the parents, not just the relatives, not just the friends, entire village.
And as a parent, I think I can respond to that question a little differently. My daughter went through something similar, where at a swim meet, somebody was giving her a hard time about her bindi, and she basically just lit him up, literally lit him up to say, you don't know anything of what you're talking about, get out of my face, I don't want to talk to you again. And sometimes we look at it and go, oh my God, my kid is becoming so aggressive. But as a person who grew up in India who would never dream of doing that, I look at my daughter when she does that, and eventually it kind of hit me. She's just being American. That's what an American kid does. I mean, Sucharita's point is well taken. Our kids are American. That is our biggest learning. If we take anything out of this, we have to accept the fact they're born here, they're raised here, they're American. We just have to figure out how to be an American, how to let them be an American Hindu. They're not going to be Indian Hindu. That's a guarantee. I will certify that, right? The question is, how do we give them the backup and how do we give them the support structure that they can be good American Hindus? So vegetarianism, for example, my daughter doesn't even bother talking about religion. She simply says, look, there's an awful lot of people who are vegetarian because they don't want to eat meat. I'm just one of them. It's okay. Internally, she might feel very sattvic and she might say, you know what, we have reverence for animals and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, it's not necessary. It's not necessary to get into a religious description of your religious practice. I think that was a key learning and a takeaway for me when our daughter pointed out that, look, just because you have a religious explanation for something doesn't mean I'm going to share it with my friends, because they're not going to get it. And I have no desire to kind of get into this theological argument with them. I'm just going to tell them I'm a vegetarian because I like being a vegetarian, like many people are vegetarian. And we as parents, we have to accept that. It's okay. You know, it's the practice that counts, not necessarily the background. So we don't want to go to the opposite side and start getting militant about Hinduism either, right?
Yes.
We just want the right to practice Hinduism the way we like to, and give our kids the right tools to deal with it when somebody walks up and says, how come you're so weird? The answer should always be, no, we are not weird. You just haven't learned enough about us. That's all. We're just like anybody else. Not, like I said, not all Jews wear yarmulkes. That's okay. You know? Absolutely.
And that's a great point to end today's discussion and talk with. We can go on and on for a long time. I think we're basically out of time. It's 6:30. We had about 67 people join us today, and it's really, really good to see that excitement This is a very important topic, and so it's certainly not going to end here. This is just the beginning of it. One big thing of the Hindu Parents Network is going to be addressing bullying and making sure that we have the tools required for our kids to become proud of their culture, not be shy about what they are, who they are. And if they do face those issues, if parents themselves face those issues, to have that platform on a regular basis where they can come together, have one-on-one discussions or a group discussion, things like that. And also be the change, right? You got to be the change you wish to see in the world. So you got to make sure that you take the ownership by running for schools of boards of education, by running for PTAs, and making that change happen locally. Because the more they see brown in those representations, the more they'll try to understand your perspective. And given where we are today in terms of Black Lives Matter, cultural competency training, racism, discussions, all these things, equality, all of those things we have to take advantage of and say, you know what, equality doesn't exclude us. You know, there is no equation that says some are more equal than others. Equal means equal. So we have to demand our seat at the table. And only when we do that, we'll be able to make a difference. So as Hindu Parents Network, we need to keep that in mind, that it's not just about learning some shlokas and mantras and things like that, but how does that apply to today's world? How am I going to take the Taittiriya Upanishad or the Purusha Suktam or anything that I recite every day to my daily life? How am I going to solve my problems on a daily basis? And if we cannot give that answer to our children, guess what? They're going to completely discard it. One person that I spoke with said that I go to the temple for 1 hour and I feel like I'm in a French class and I have no understanding of French. Okay, this was this young professional's experience, and that's why he stopped being a Hindu, not from a name perspective, but basically from all the rituals and things like that. So imagine that, and that's where we stand as a community. So I want to thank everybody today. This is excellent discussion. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank Sucharita. Samyukta also left, and all the parents who participated, asked a lot of questions. There's a lot going on the chat here, which means that a lot of people are interested in these. We will have some questions. So what I would suggest is if you can register on the link I sent over, cohna.org/event-registration, so we can give you guys updates about what we're trying to do. And if you're interested in volunteering, send an email to info@cohna.org. We would love to have you as part of the Hindu Parents Network. Thank you, and namaste to all.
Namaste. Thank you for arranging this, Nikunj. Appreciate it. And thanks to all the parents who joined.
Yes.